So, hi, my name is Rocio Mondragon Reyes, and I am based in Sacramento, California. I have been working for the past almost 2 years at Students Rising Above, which is a nonprofit based in San Francisco, as a career development program lead two. And also important is the fact that I've been a school board member to my alma mater for the past 3 years.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rocio, for joining me on the podcast. Very excited to have you here to share your story, your journey as an educator in the Sacramento area, and the important work that you're doing, especially as a board member. I'm excited to hear more about your experiences, especially for your alma mater. I know how like those formative years are very important, but they were not perfect, right? That there's definitely areas to be improved upon, specific concerns that you have that you were able to raise. And I think, identity, cultural identity, racial identity, all of those are really, really important for the community that you represent. And so that is something that, yeah, we'll definitely talk about as it relates to this concept of global citizenship. So thank you. And I like to have my guests share out a little bit about the various milestones of their journey, their professional career. So being that you've spent your career within education, um, I'd love to hear like what brought you into this line of work, and what were some of the various kind of decisions that you made, opportunities that you had that ultimately got you to where you are today.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having me here to share my own story and perspective. Well, I think I'll start off with what got me here. I think it's very important for me to start off with naming the fact that I'm a first generation college student and I now a first generation grad school student. I'm the eldest daughter to undocumented immigrant parents. And so that, like, not just being first generation, but being the first in line to pave that pathway, um, it has been a big marker in everything that I've chosen to do. Um, I did not start off in the education field. I remember as early as third grade, very much respecting and admiring my teachers, and it really started with my mom as an immigrant who only went up to sixth grade in her small town in Michoacan, Mexico, um, instilling in myself and my siblings the idea that um, like stick close to your teachers. They know the way. Like whatever I cannot teach you, they will know how to help you. And so that is something I really took to heart and help. And I remember from a very young age feeling fond of my teachers and admiring and respecting them and seeking out their advice constantly. Um, and so sometimes I did toil with the idea of maybe someday I'll be a teacher. But there was also this other very prominent factor in my life, which was that my parents were undocumented immigrants. And so the amount of times that the topic at the dinner table was the insecurities that that brought in terms of socio and economically was like every day. And so I also had this aspiration of being an immigration attorney, as I know a lot of children of immigrants do. And so, really, in as early as ninth grade, I sought out an internship in the immigration field, and I interned for all 4 years of high school at an immigration law firm, working on cases and hearing the stories of clients who are redacting memos and declarations. And so that's where my professional journey starts. It starts with seeing these things that had a big impact in my life and wanting to do something about them and seeking out opportunities for myself. Not necessarily with this idea that it would lead me into this career or anything, but rather just because in the moment I felt an urge to do something. And so it starts there. And then in college, I thought I would continue to pursue more of the law or the immigration law specifically route, and I actually found myself doing more of the education route and doing tutoring for adult English learners as something that I really got involved with in college. Went into When I was graduating college, my first job was a DOJ accredited rep in New York and providing free immigration legal services to undocumented immigrants in Staten Island. Um, and that's where, even though I had done that kind of work prior to, being the DOJ accredited rep versus the intern and doing so under the Trump administration and having that be my first full-time job and being a first gen grad, that was a lot. And so COVID happened, blew me back to California, transitioned into a paralegal job at an immigration law firm here, and continuing to experience the impact of the Trump administration in that way. I decided to pivot into what had always been in the back of my head of like education I might want to do something with that. So that's when I took a job as an administrative associate at Making Waves Foundation in Richmond. And I learned a lot about the behind the scenes, and then decided I wanted to do more hands-on work with students. And so now as a career development program lead, I work specifically in supporting third and fourth year students, college students who are first gen and low income from the 9 Bay Area counties in their transition from college to career. So where it's taken me.
Amazing. Well, I mean, I just find that, your roots, like going back to your family, specifically to your parents, and how growing up and seeing these gaps, these injustices all around you, um, really paved this kind of like it paved a path, but like that you walked, of course, but like the direction of like seeking greater understanding, empathizing with those who are going through similar experiences, and this transition from law or immigration law, I think you specified, to education. It actually seems quite seamless, right? From what I can gather, you being the eldest of your siblings, you probably took on greater responsibility, more responsibility than what a child who does not have undocumented parents who have to like understand these legal terms and understand all of these different policies. Like, there's I feel like an education element there,
Mhm.
right? Maybe with how you had to, at times maybe translate, I don't know, or kind of like read into certain terms. Could you share a little bit more about those, difficult times or conversations that you had and the role that you played as the eldest of your siblings?
Yes, of course. Well, you hit the nail on the head. It's definitely, I don't think it's every immigrant, every child of immigrants experience, right? But my experience was definitely the one of, I mean, as early as 3 and 4 years old, the minute I learned how to read and write, the purpose of me learning how to read and write was not for school, but to be my parents' right hand. And so it was the minute that I could read and write. My dad was a landscaper and he did not go past second grade. And so my mom is the one who's most literate in Spanish, but is not fully literate. Um, so the minute I learned how to read and write, it was things like um, writing the payment slip for my dad's clients. It was helping like at the time it was still those manual maps that like no GPS, right? It's like, okay, help my dad figure out what street he has to get to his job. It was translating at school, but at parent teacher conferences. It was translating at the ER when my mom would have asthma attacks. It was advocating so the doctor would actually pay attention to her and not just dismiss her, right? It was sometimes like the doctor would be maybe a couple minutes into the consultation and realize that the child was translating and be like, wait, can we get an actual translator in here? So that was definitely the experience. And I do think that it was very closely tied. like looking back on it, it was uh I have now come to believe that one of the greatest skill sets that you need as a first gen student, even as a low income student, trying to make it in especially in the US through higher ed, is to know how to advocate for yourself. If you do not know, and if you are not willing to advocate for yourself, I now believe that the amount of resources and the quality out there does not matter. If you don't feel empowered to do that, you will not make it through. And so at the time, I was definitely a very introverted and even shy child. But in a lot of ways, the fact that I had no other choice, and that me being that advocate for my family and my dad's right hand and the translator, putting me in these places of survival mode, um, meant that by the time I got to high school and college, I was pretty comfortable advocating for myself, and to a certain extent demanding my rights and what I was entitled to as a student in the US. And that was not just given to me off the bat because I was first gen and low income and bilingual and etc. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I love that. You know, you place special emphasis on knowing how to advocate for yourself and, you know, pointing out that it's such a crucial skill for, you know, individuals who have similar, but, you know, of course, different backgrounds, but that, you know, need to, you know, speak up for themselves, speak up for their families, their loved ones. So it's clear that there was mm, this process, right? As you were put into this very difficult situation, right? As you know, a young person, being asked to interpret, to translate, to do a lot of things, and that maybe at first came across as maybe you were, I would imagine, like being just a young person, a bit reluctant to do a lot of those things. Why, you know, why me? Or oh, that's difficult, or oh, I'm not feeling comfortable, or maybe I'm being shy. And then this kind of again transition, I mean, this development of you to really understand, like, oh, this is why I'm doing it, or this is, you know, this is for, you know, empowerment of our, you know, kind of status as a family, or like things that we need as a family. So my question, you know, is one about advocacy. For you personally, was there like a particular moment that you were like that there was like a clear break with kind of the reluctance or timid, you know, Rocio, who had to advocate, and then the more, you know, the empowered of like greater agency. No, like I need to advocate. Can you recall like a moment where you had that breakthrough?
Yeah, it's really split in two. Now I try to be as succinct with both of them because they're both very much like big markers in my life and that particular question there. But the first part of it was when my parents decided to take us back as a family to Mexico. My siblings and I were all born here, parents weren't. Um, and we went back, and the idea was we were going to relocate permanently and stay there. Um, and my parents enrolled us in school, and academics was not the issue. Like I got top of the class, finished third grade there because my mom had always made a point to make us bilingual, right? Um, and but for fourth grade was difficult, became more difficult socially. My fourth grade teacher was very dismissive of my academic support needs, particularly when it came to math, because they were more advanced in times tables there. And so for any teacher that knew me prior to that would have been very shocked to know that a month into fourth grade, I literally told my mom, I'm not going back to school anymore. Like, I'm not continuing this because of how my teacher treated me. And so, and my mom didn't protest it because in Mexico, you don't get the like free textbooks or the free uniform if you're low income, right? And if you don't have money to buy food, you don't get lunch, like you don't eat. And so it was becoming very expensive for my parents to send us to public school, like not private school, public school. And so that's why she didn't protest it. Point is, that whole year of fourth grade, the only thing I dedicated myself to, my mom had taken a lot of our workbooks and reading materials, etc. Every day, I would self-teach myself math. I would self-teach myself how to read and write, etc. And at least every week, I would beg my parents to bring us back. And that's where it started. It was like, I need to go back. I need to go back to my school. And because I always did feel very at home in school and learning. Like I just enjoyed learning. Like some of the first photos my mom has of me is me with a pen in a random envelope and like I want to write. And so I at some point I told my mom, she had taken some of the like doctor cards from like the clinic we would go to and the school office. I'm like, I'm gonna call these numbers if we don't go back, and I'm going to have someone like come get me. Like I need to go back to my school and I need to finish school. And so that's where it started in that sense. Came back. It like as a child then, as a fourth grader, I thought the minute I'm back, it's all going to resolve itself. I'm going to be back. It's going to be fine, right? Was met with the shock that no, like things have happened. Like you're going to reintegrate yourself, and they wanted to have me redo fourth grade because there was no record of me having done fourth grade. And my fifth grade teacher um, advocated for me, put her foot down, and said, no, she's not going to redo that because she could see that if they would have done that, I was going to get frustrated. Like I was reading at a fourth grade level. And because of that, even though there was no record of me doing fourth grade, she was not going to let them do that. And she had me in her fifth grade classroom and every single day would stay with me for recess and just have me read. And she told me, forget about everything else. The only thing you're going to do is read. And so she became like, she started to be an example to me of what it meant to advocate for myself and to know myself, like the fact that I needed that I think that like that is not the solution for every like newcomer or recently arrived student, right? But for me, she and I knew that if you make me redo something just because there's no record, I'm going to get frustrated. And I'm a student, I need to push myself. Like that's how I'm going to excel here. Um, so she began to be an example to me of like knowing myself and therefore advocating for myself. And then the last part of it is whatever doubt I had about advocating for myself and coupled with whatever last bits of what it meant to be a child and just not worry about adult stuff really ended in sixth grade. January 8th, my dad was deported. And so the minute that happened, that childhood ship went sailing away. And the minute that happened, any doubts I had about advocating and being shy, etc., that went away. It was a big marker of like, this is no longer a choice. This is like what I've been born into, and this is my life, and this is what I have to do. And I have to do it for myself, for my family, and for my community. So my mom was not much less bilingual than my dad is. My mom does not deal well with bureaucracy. So I was the one speaking to my dad's attorney. I was the one figuring out money situations. I was the one figuring out how to get food on the table that time that my dad wasn't present, etc. So that was the ultimate like closing of what had been like a 3-year window. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I'm just processing that last part because it clearly was such a momentous, like event that happened for not only, you as you recall it, but your whole family. And then the fact that you said like the kind of like innocence of childhood suddenly took on this very serious tone of like, oh no, like this is like an all hands on deck. It like sharpened things in a way that you couldn't have anticipated, right? Because your initial thought process when you were back in Mexico was, I just need to get back to learning in the school that I feel comfortable in. So I appreciate how you know, speak to this question of advocacy from these two different, you know, stages. Because one, it's clear that first it was advocating for, you know, the education, right? That you felt, you know, you needed, right? And that you deserved. And then the second one is like, you know, through the model of this teacher advocating for you in under, you know, new circumstances to continue to push yourself and challenge yourself. And then suddenly having the training wheels just completely come off, given, you know, your father's deportation, and that now your education, the scope of it, you know, kind of broadened in a way where it was not just excel at school, but excel at, you know, all these other areas that, you know, encompassed the adult world, right? Kind of infringing upon itself. And then I wanted to point something out. I don't know if this is something that you've observed, but or thought about. I recall you mentioned that your father had up to second grade
Hmm.
education and your
Yes.
mother up to sixth grade, right? And I feel like, oh my gosh, like, you know, this deportation, like this, when it happened, you said you were in sixth grade.
Yes.
And I feel like there's an interesting parallel in like what your mother must have been facing when she was in sixth grade, kind of, you know, like what prompted her not to get receive the full like formal education, and how has, you know, it's not like simply not being in school, you stop learning, right? Life
Yeah.
happens. And then she is learning how to build a family. She's learning how to adapt. She's, you know, learning how to provide all of these things. And then under, you know, your circumstances, you're learning in a different way. But again, like the scenarios is different with having to continue with schooling and then adding this on top. I just feel like there's something about that sixth grade, that departure point for both you and your mom, that I'm sure really is something that speaks to resilience, right? That you had to, like, you, there was no other option to forge this new pathway through advocacy. So I don't know if you maybe you've already made that
I
connection.
had not thought about that very much like before. But it's definitely yeah, as I'm thinking about the reasons that made her not continue her education, yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to that family responsibility, that the situations, the circumstances we're born into places on us, and that at some points in our life we have to make choices, right? And there's like I like to often reflect as I'm connecting the dots in my life about the forks in the road and like those markers,
Hmm.
not for the sake of like pondering so much on the what if, but more of like how those markers have defined us, right?
Yeah, definitely. And you know, one of these big forks in the road, you mentioned was the kind of transition away from law specifically, and then going into education via the tutoring that you did in college, to then the various you know, work with like supporting individuals with like I think you mentioned about the DOJ, like free legal services, and you know, trying to then you know, get into, you know, you're working in schools as an administration associate, and then now as a career development program lead. What what would you say has been like, hmm, like as you, it's all interconnected as from what I can tell, and especially the, you know, the I don't know if you mentioned this, but I remember you sharing how the population that you serve, and also the fact that it's your alma mater with the school work and being on the board, it's, you know, individuals who have similar you know, experiences, right? Possibly they're low income, they make up a certain majority within their ethnicity, you know, and so like how has that been like for you to interact with this community and to, in many ways, you know, be that like reassuring voice of like, I know where you're coming from. And like within education, like what kind of light does that take on that maybe you wouldn't have seen if you were just strictly within law? like you're kind of seeing it from a different, vantage point in how you engage with them. So I'm just, if you can unpack a little bit of that and what your experiences have been, I think that would be really interesting.
Yeah, of course. Well, to me, it starts off with, it's just in the simplest of terms. For me, it's been an experience of, this is why representation matters. Like, the amount of teachers or educators or just people in my life, adults in my life, who had like similar backgrounds to I, and not just like being Mexican American, but beyond that, were very limited when I was growing up. And so for me, a lot of it is, I believe that representation makes a difference, and I believe that meaningful representation or active representation in the sense of like, don't just be on the school board, but get to engage and get to know, also be very, I try to be very self-aware that that just because I come from Roseland as a community, for example, doesn't mean that the community hasn't drastically changed from when I was a part of the school district myself as a student 10 years ago, right? So being very self-aware that there's changes that occur over time, and nonetheless, I think historically it's been proven that there's always just some things that never change and that tie us together and that sound all too familiar. And it's like, oh, that. And then sometimes it's a little disheartening. It's like, oh, it hasn't changed. Like, thought we'd be somewhere else by now. And I think we can all relate to that, whether it's within our own local communities or like the world and society. Um, and I think that the big difference with like experiencing that in law versus education, um, I think one of them is with law, the path in terms of like you're changing individuals' lives. Like, for example, as immigration for legal, you have to focus on the impact that you're making on this one individual's life in their case, and try to put out of mind the fact that you're not really doing anything though about the law. Like the fact, like your hands are tied very much so, in terms of, at the end of the day, if you can't find a way to help this person in the way that the outcome is desired with the laws you got and the policy you have, unless you're going to get up and go and lobby and be a policymaker and do that, you're going to have to say, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do for you right now. And so that's one of the things that I mean, I knew that when I was in high school. I saw it very quickly when I was an intern, like, and I still decided to go ahead and be a DOJ accredited rep because I felt like I wanted to explore it further as a full-time career. But it can become very jarring very quickly to just go screen a client after client, and sometimes you start thinking like, it's a 10-to-1 ratio, like 10 people I can't help, one person I can. Like, it starts to become a little jarring sometimes. Whereas with education, it's not to say that our hands aren't tied in so many ways, right? Like, I'm very well aware about all the systemic challenges, but there's a lot more you can do. Like, I like, there's a lot more ways, and the pathway is so much more, mm, a little bit more forgiving, and like, oh, you right now you're deciding you don't want to go to college. That's great. How else can I support you? Let's stay in contact 2 years down the line. You do want to go to college now? Okay, now let's make it happen. It's things like that, like the ability to work through those systemic challenges just feels a lot more forgiving in the education field, and a little bit more uplifting than it did in the law field, at least for me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That response was great. Because I feel like my question was a little bit convoluted, but you addressed how hmm it was there was a lot that you were interested in with the law side, but like actually experiencing it and then understanding that perhaps there was a kind of like band-aid approach, right, in the capacity that you found yourself in, and that there was this kind of painful realization maybe that you can't help them all. And then with education, and how it's phrased, like education, just the system itself, like, the domain has expanded greatly. And there's this very much future oriented, like how your actions, whether they be one-on-one or at the policy level, district level, that does set, these students up to like learn from there. Like, it's not like just like a one time, just try to get over this one hurdle, but there can be more strategy involved, like what you were saying with career advice, right? Yeah, you can go to college, but you don't have to as well. And you can always circle back, right? So I think that's
If I may, I just had
yeah, of
this.
course.
I think the big difference, if I can summarize it in like one sentence, law, and because I've worked with other types of attorneys, like by the time you're in the reason you're interacting with a client, regardless of whether you're an attorney or whatever, you're working in the office, is because they're in a bad situation now. Like you are trying to undo the the mistakes or the like the impact of policies that restrain people, right? Like you're trying to undo something. Whereas education, and I understand like it's different, like at different levels, like depending on what kind of age and range of students you're working with, but for the most part, it's building up. Like you're not undoing something, you're trying to build up. And so that's what I think ultimately makes the difference in like how you may feel in the two fields. Because I think there's also a lot that can be done with law. And I'm still very much intrigued by that. But it's definitely, you're trying to undo something, not building up as much.
Yeah, no, yeah, I agree. Yeah, no shade on law. We need really amazing, attorneys and paralegals and
Yeah.
that kind of bunched up tingling effect of like, oh, I'm in a bad situation. Like, you know, for there to be hope, they need to untangle themselves, right? And it's not just only on them. So yes, but I appreciate that point that you made to kind of distinguish between them. And it's very clear the way that you see the students that you support in your capacity as like a career development program lead, but also your work on the board, which is much bigger, right? And bigger in the sense of like the system itself, right? Like the school district. And I that kind of thinking involves a lot of strategy. It definitely combines what you spoke about, active representation as well. That you're not doing lip service to anyone. You're saying, no, I'm part of this community. I have full stakes still to this day. And what can we do to support future generations? So when you're thinking on this like larger scale, on how to support students, I'm curious, like if clearly the local context matters, right? It's fundamental. Um, but how, in what ways do you think about the larger context of like where these students will go beyond just their local communities? Is that something that is brought into conversations, for example, in the board that you sit on, or is something that you consider just kind of as an independent, right? Just thinking about like, wow, perhaps there's something like kind of a goal that you're striving towards that maybe can be akin to this notion of global citizenship.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I'll start off with on a personal level. Um, a lot of and it does have to do a lot of why I personally choose to serve on the school board. I come from a community that is very like it's predominantly Hispanic and um predominantly low income, and most of the students that graduate are first gen, and predominantly stay within the community, even in terms of like going to the local junior college and the local state school, and not a lot go out of state. And so when having been one of the first to go to a major school, first off, and a predominantly white institution, as is Georgetown. I haven't gone to the first major private school from my school. It was definitely experiencing that shock of I had never really left home. Like I had lived in Mexico, but it was with my family, right? And I was not exposed to the amount of wealth and resources and just like that is Georgetown and these institutions, right? And I was going to be across the country and a flight away. And so when I think about that, and I think about the kinds of people that I had as my peers, and that it was very clear from day one at Georgetown, oh, this is no longer Roseland, and this is no longer about me getting a well-paying job after I graduate here, or just a job. Like like at institutions like Georgetown, as I think a lot of us know, this is about how are you going to put Georgetown on the global map? Like, what are you going to do in terms of your career to keep our name on the map? Like, this isn't, and I sometimes I'm hesitant about saying this in terms of how it might come off, but I think that if we put feelings aside and we really focus on the fact that I believe that whether we want to admit it or not, institutions like universities are part of capitalism and business and social economic classes, right? And so having had a sister that went to a CSU and seeing students go to CSUs, UCs, and then versus private schools, I very much believe that the curriculum, the resources, the connections that these schools provide have very different goals in mind in terms of what they expect their students will come out and do. And that's not to say that there won't be the outlier graduates, right, the alum, but I do think that state schools mainly focus on to go out and be a worker and we don't necessarily expect you to be the world leaders, even if they might like say in their pamphlets. Like, I don't really think that it's I don't really think that the curriculum and resources and connections indicate that to the degree that schools like Georgetown push for it, right? Because that's the only way they stay on the map. That's the only way they're going to continue getting their endowment. So with that, I very quickly started to get like, oh, like this is where Bill Clinton graduated. And again, like you're talking to a girl that comes from this other community that had nothing to do with Bill Clinton, and you put her in this other community. And where that matters to me now, as I continue to work in my community, is when I think about the different aspirations that students have, and I think about why it's so important to me to expose more first-gen low-income students to institutions like Georgetown. It's because, unfortunately, for better or for worse, these are the types of institutions where people come out from and will sit at tables with a lot of power. And whether you're like, even if I were to graduate from there and not go sit at a table with power or influence, being in class discussions with people who will, and when we're discussing things like being low income or first gen, right? Because a lot of especially like social justice classes do it. It's important that someone with the lived experience is in the classroom sharing their experience. And that's not just people who haven't lived in those shoes. And it's important that I get those other perspectives, right? And so for me, that's why it's so when I think about what is my purpose on something like the school board, it's doing whatever I can to ensure that we're making systemic changes so that more students are exposed to these kinds of institutions, hopefully get a seat at the table there.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And, various things come to mind as you were kind of relating this story of going to undergrad across the country to a very, very elite university like Georgetown, and the kind of shock that must have had on you, your family, your community, right? People talking, oh my God, where did Rocio go to? Oh, Georgetown. Whoa, whoa, like that kind of thing. And the of course, I'm sure that experience for you on a personal level was like, it changed how you understand the networks, the community links that you navigate, the potential as well of like, well, now I can lay claim to a new network. Why not? Right. And then making the next kind of jump in understanding power relations, having that seat at the table, and going back to advocating for yourself and being like, I deserve that seat. And it's not just because you're, drunk with power and want to, be there just for the sake of being there, but it's again this active representation. And for someone who comes from your community to see you sitting on this board to interact with you as they listen to your story, there's a sense of hope too, I would say, that's vital when let's be honest, right? The society with which they live in, under a capitalistic model, um, is it can be crushing, like soul crushing, and it can be financially crippling, and so they need these kind of like North Stars in a way, at least to build this progress and momentum, and of course all the while your work, looking at the systemic kind of areas, like how can we create new pathways that weren't there when you were in their shoes. I think it has to be multi-pronged, right? And that's where the strategy also comes in. So it makes a lot of sense, and I think in connecting it to global citizenship, maybe it's the recognition of those emerging networks that you're exposed to, how that ties into an awareness that um, there's so many different social layers that are involved, but then there's also the cultural side of like, well, your roots in Mexico, but then also your roots in the Bay Area as an American, and how there are these interesting confluences like that form, you, and your authentic self. And I feel like global citizenship really tries to marry those things together, and not, look at it from more of like a exclusivist or deficit-based, approach. So yes, thank you for sharing that. Would you say that that you would consider yourself as a global citizen? Is that something you can definitively say, or would you like to just explore the concept a little bit in terms of like, well, this is kind of where I'm at with that concept?
Yes, I would definitely like to share my reflection on that one because I think that Georgetown's a Jesuit school, and so it's very much about service for others, right? And I was a part of the school foreign service, so very much I went from this little town to being surrounded by people who from all over the world, places I had never heard of. And so, in a lot of ways, it is like your personal statement is about global citizenship, like what do you want to do in the world. So at the time I thought 17-year-old me thought about like, oh, I want to be able to interact with people from across cultures and diverse perspectives, right? And I just want to be exposed to the world in a lot of ways that I never had the privilege to. um and then now, and especially as I think about my time having worked in immigration law, and even working with students who come from different countries, right? And whose citizenship status is not necessarily citizenship, but something else. Um, I think about it a little bit differently, and I think as I myself have changed or evolutioned in the socioeconomic ladder, like I'm no longer the low income high school graduate, right? Like I have an office job, well paying job, decent paying job, with a college degree and a soon to be Harvard degree. Like I can't pretend that I'm still that disenfranchised teenager. And so as I've gone through that, I think one of the big clashes growing up that I never really dissected, and just now I'm starting to dissect more as I become more self-aware of how I've changed in my privilege, is the fact that even though I definitely felt the burden of my parents being undocumented and all that came with that, I was not undocumented. So I have a passport that allows me a lot of privileges. Um, and that's not my parents' case, right? And so when I think about global citizenship now, I especially think about that citizenship part. What does that mean? And having to acknowledge the privilege that comes with, and the privilege it comes with to say, oh, I consider myself a global citizen, which in college, especially after having studied abroad a full year, I would have told you, yes, I do. Like I am a worldly traveler, and like I very much enjoy like engaging with all different types of ideas and concepts, and that's what makes me a global citizen. And while I think that there's still a lot of beauty to thinking about how you can interact across cultures and etc., I also think that whether beautiful or not, we need to interact or grapple with the privilege that comes with, and that's become very important to me. Because I looked up global. One of the definitions I saw was about embracing the whole of something, and so I think that at places like Georgetown, global citizenship, the conception I was first presented about with it was a very like glamorized way of saying like we serve others and we're people from all cultures, and that's great and wonderful, um, and very valid. And then I also start thinking, but I think my parents are also global citizens, and they are actually like lived across, right? But because of their social status, their experience is not uplifted in the same way of being a global citizen, right? So just grappling with those kinds of things, I think I would rather say that I'm globally aware, and I don't know about the citizen.
Well, thank you for, being so honest and really, showing in, you know, live time, right? Like right in this moment, how you're grappling with this concept that, in many ways, like people look to it, like global citizen as like a buzz term, right? And so you'll find different definitions and you'll find different environments with which they talk about it. And yes, it often is ladled, or not ladled, saddled with great privilege in that you have this passport, right? You have the privilege of being able to travel as a way to expose yourself. And while that is very powerful, and I would say both of us, right, have been able to experience that as one of our great privileges to go to different places, whether that be in the US or outside of the US, there are individuals who simply can't do that. And I love that you mentioned how, your parents, you see them in this light of like, but they're global citizens as well, maybe in the way that they valued community, in the way that they were service oriented, their selfless dedication to their children, their hopes and dreams, the way they connected with people. All of those things, I think, speak to a shared sense of humanity, of really wanting to model that and to uplift others around them. And I think to speak, I mean, we could probably continue this conversation on another podcast episode, but I do think that that is a lot more of what resonates with me personally about global citizenship. rather than the way with which you describe Georgetown. And no shade on Georgetown. I mean, again, you could have it both ways in which you can travel abroad while at the same time being able to sense this deeper interconnectedness that we all have. But that
Yeah.
interconnectedness kind of transcends time and space, with which, it could be the person literally right next to you. You don't have to go thousands of miles, like some stranger, and say, you know,
Mhm.
connected. So yeah, I think continuing to grapple with it and then, having this global awareness, as you stated, it's I think it's just to kind of grapple with it is what I'm trying to, have as a takeaway that
Yeah,
we
of
can.
course.
Mm.
Mhm.
So yeah, so thank you so much. And the last question I wanted to ask relates to book and movie recommendations. So is there anything that you've seen recently, watched recently, or like something that you come back to often that relates to this conversation that we've been having about, your story, and also about global citizenship, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, there's a book, and if I go back to markers in my life, right in sixth grade, the first like adult book that I read in my life, which was after my dad's deportation, and I've been coming back to recently, and I've been rereading passages. Dreams from My Father by Barack Obama. It just, and I think very much into have been coming back to in terms of exploring what has my own pathway as this quote unquote global citizen, and trying to be just more self-aware of my own privileges. The way he tells his story and what he shares about grappling with the trade-offs and his own story, both as a Black man, but also this immigration component to it with his father's side. And that to me, as a sixth grader, it really, it was the first time I saw myself in the story of someone else, even though he wasn't like, our lives weren't that similar in a lot of ways, right? But it was the first time I saw someone have this like tension with themselves, and to grapple with that, and to think about the places he was at by then, which was he was president by then by the time I was reading it, and to think about these dots that in his life that had to be connected for that to happen. So that's the book that I keep coming back to.
That's a great book recommendation. Thank you so much. And sixth grade is such a critical point, a
I have
juncture.
to think more on that one.
Yeah, you should grapple with sixth grade even more. I'll think about my sixth grade experience too. But maybe there's something there for me too. But yeah, I mean, I like you spoke about through reading this book by Barack Obama and seeing yourself very much in that story, and that tension. I feel like I'm visualizing this rubber band, right? Those like new rubber bands out of the package, and it's kind of hard to like stretch them out. So maybe, it's been this process of like kind of seeing where you had started and where you are now, and the
Yeah.
kind of, sense of resiliency through a rubber band of like elasticity. I don't know how far I can stretch that, metaphor, but I do think that it gives this sense of like, just really being in awe at like what you have, where you have gone, what you have achieved, and how you remain in, this inspiration and hope for so many of the students and families that you represent in your capacity as a school board member. So thank you so much. And I want to give the last word to you if there's any final thoughts or just kind of, closing remarks that you'd like to have. Anything.
No, I just want to thank you for the time. I mean, I think you know this about me through class, that I consider myself a writer, and this is the first time that instead of writing, I've spoken through this. So thank you for the opportunity to do that.